morning and welcome to another segment of Capital Preview. I'm Bill Peard and I'll be your host this morning. Our guest on Capital Preview today is Representative Chip Baltimore, Republican from Boone. Good morning, Representative.
Good morning, Bill. How are you this morning?
I'm good.
Great.
Hey, I think the thing on everyone's mind right now is our budget. I know that's the most important thing that the legislature takes up during its session, and so I'd kind of like you to kind of go through that a little bit, and give an expation of where you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's going to go.
Everything we do up there, is dependent upon the budget, and so it's really is the crucial piece that we really need to get figured out. And I think this year's going to be especially challenging from a budget perspective. Mainly because I think we have different opinions throughout the Capitol about what the state of our economy looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us that live in rural Iowa are very concerned about the economy for the next year or two, mainly because we're seeing the ag economy start to slow down. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we had $15 beans and $7 corn, and farmers were making a lot of money and they were spending a lot of money, which had a great ripple effect throughout the economy and allowed our sales tax and income tax revenues to grow substantially. Well, now we're starting to see that slow down in rural Iowa. We're back to sub $3 corn and $8 beans or so, and that's a significant revenue impact on rural Iowa. So. And I think in the urban areas we're seeing more success. We're seeing some economic success that's still there and some more expansion. So I think it's going to be mainly a different philosophy about, in uncertain economic times, do we go ahead and spend what we believe we're going to get in, or do we start to hedge ourselves for perhaps an economic downturn? And I think those two philosophies are going to be in constant tension up at the Capitol on the budget this year.
So since the budget, and this is more out of curiosity than anything else, Chip, but since you came from an ag background, why do you think this slowdown of the ag economy has occurred? I mean,
well, a couple of things. I think you've seen the crop prices come down substantially, and there's international reasons for that, and national reasons for that, and energy reasons for all of that, and I think that's always going to be a cycle that we go through. But when we had great economic times in the ag world, input costs went up substantially for farmers. Landowners increased cash rent substantially. Seed costs went up. Fertilizer costs went up substantially. So the input costs go up, and then when the revenue goes down, it really puts farmers in a squeeze. And so I think that's probably the biggest source of concern right now out in rural Iowa in terms of the ag economy.
Sure. I know you've been working on longer-term criminal sentencing up there too, so you might want to kind of give our viewers a little bit of explanation as to what that's all about. You bet.
Well, as chair of the House Judiciary Committee, part of my responsibility is to take a look at some of the broader policy initiatives that we have in terms of the criminal law and criminal sentencing in Iowa. And one of the increased focuses that we're trying to have is whether our overall criminal sentencing system is fair and appropriate and really in the best interest of all Iowans. And that means just the general public, it means the criminals themselves, it means their victims, and the overall system and how much all of that costs in terms of actual tax dollars, but then also societal costs as well. And so one of the things that we're starting to work on now, and it's going to be a longer-term project, is taking a look at the overall criminal sentencing system. So sentences from the simplest misdemeanor up to the most serious first-degree murder type, and try to make sure that we've got fairness and good public policy in terms of the appropriate sentences, especially for some of the more nonviolent offenses, to see if there are other ways that we can address those crimes than simply incarcerating them, putting them in prison, and then trying to deal with them on the back end once they get out.
Sure. Okay. Educational funding. I know that is the big hot potato right now up there in the legislature. So, kind of give me your snapshot on that a little bit.
I'm not a big fan of the way we fund education in this state. We do it on a per pupil basis. It's $6,300 and some odd per pupil. And then we have this constant fight every single year in the legislature about how much we're going to increase that on a per pupil basis. In the meantime, we're seeing massive demographic changes in pupils. We're seeing urbanization of families and students. Rural Iowa, by the same token, struggling to keep young people in rural Iowa. And so when you have a rural school district that loses kids or their student population goes down, then their funding goes down because it's all based on a per pupil basis. Well, you know, from an educational cost perspective, a teacher pretty much costs the same whether they're teaching 12 kids or 20 kids.
That's right.
And yet the funding for 12 kids is dramatically lower than 20 kids. And so I think we need to go back and take a look at how we fund schools in general, knowing that when you're in rural Iowa and you're serving a large geographic district to get the critical mass of students you need to have a school, we need to make sure that they've got the resources necessary to have science teachers and math teachers and English teachers and industrial tech teachers and art teachers and music teachers out there in sufficient numbers to give every child that opportunity. And what we're seeing, especially in rural Iowa, is we're starting to see school districts, because they're losing funding, because they're losing students, start to cut into some of those less critical instructional subjects like art and music and industrial tech. And I just think that that's wrong. I think that we need to sit back and take a better look at what kind of critical mass student population we need and what kind of critical mass funding we need for that, and figure out a better way other than just count the number of students and say, you know, there you go. Now, you know, the number of students in a school district is a factor in funding. I mean, it's got to be. But again, I think we just need to do better than simply going up and having a bloodbath in the legislature every year over 1.25% and 4%, or 2% and 6%, or 3% and 7%. I mean, that's just it's a losing battle for everybody in the end, and quite honestly, it's a losing battle for the students of Iowa if that's the only way we're going to do it.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes sense. Medical marijuana, another hot issue right there. I know they're trying to figure out that formula. You know, they passed the bill last year, and now they're trying to figure out how it's going to work. Yeah,
you know, I can say they passed the bill last year. I wasn't in favor of it last year. Not that I don't believe that marijuana may have medicinal benefits. I think it probably does. The problem is I'm not a scientist and I don't know that. And there's not a whole lot of science out there to show what it can or should do. And regardless of what the state of Iowa does, it is still illegal under federal law. And so unless we want to sit here and start down the path of saying, you know, we're going to ignore federal law. I know the federal administration has said that they're not going to prosecute for this administration. Who knows what a future administration would do. I think the best thing that we should be doing right now is asking the federal government to reclassify from a Schedule I to a Schedule II, so that then the appropriate scientific communities can start doing the scientific research necessary to figure out what the good benefits are, if any, and where it shouldn't be used, and they can start doing that research in order to make sure that we get the appropriate benefits out of it. And do it based on science, not based on anecdotal evidence or at-home experimentation. I think that's particularly dangerous for families, especially families of young kids that have debilitating diseases, to be experimenting with their child to see what may or may not alleviate some very, very serious symptoms. And I have the greatest sympathy for those families that are dealing with ill loved ones. But we really need to kind of put the horse back in the barn at this point and put it out the right door.
Sure.
Put it out the door with the corral around it, so that we can make sure that it's regulated appropriately and the science is done correctly, rather than just opening the barn door and letting it out just to roam free.
Sure.
That's my thought.
Very good. Well, our time's up this morning,
Great.
Representative Baltimore, but we do appreciate you coming in here this morning.
It's always
and
happy
sharing.
to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Our next guest will be Representative Scott Orth. Thank you for joining us here this morning on Capitol Preview.